Hey everybody, and welcome to another Kano Reviews. Today we take a look at the classic console FPS Perfect Dark for the Nintendo 64 that was released in 2000. This 20-year-old game of course had to be reviewed as well after I've done my review of Goldeneye and was surprised how good it was for its time and still playable after so many years. Surely its spiritual successor and worldwide hit Perfect Dark should be as good, if not even better, right? Well, that's what I remember too, weirdly enough, but playing it again made me quite surprised that it was lacking in some departments. When Goldeneye originally came out, I was 6 years old and was way too young to understand the English, and so I often did not know what the objectives entailed and could not finish the missions. By the time Perfect Dark came out, I was quite a bit older and thus I knew a bit more what to do. From what I recall, I had a lot more fun with Perfect Dark than Goldeneye. It was prettier, the missions were more colorful, it had split-screen co-op, and even multiplayer against bots. A lot of improvements for sure, but what I found out during my playthrough of it recently is that the story campaign in and of itself is actually inferior to Goldeneye, and that was a very big shock to me. Let's dissect the game, as it improves on some things compared to Goldeneye, but also takes some steps back on other fronts. Let's first begin with the presentation of the game. This includes story, graphics, sound, and music. On all these fronts, the game leaps ahead of Goldeneye by a long shot. In 2000, the Nintendo 64 was coming to its end cycle, meaning that the full potential from the console could be used in games that were released. I always love comparing launch games of certain consoles with the last year titles, since there's always such a big difference in graphical fidelity. Not to mention that the Nintendo 64 had an expansion pack by the end, giving games that came out in the last 2 years just an extra boost in graphical power. The environments in Perfect Dark look great. There isn't a single level that reminds me of the ugly levels from Goldeneye, like Statue or Jungle. You fight your way through apartment buildings, a villa in the tropics, snowy fields, alien planets, and on the plane Air Force One. Buildings feel way more colorful and varied, and are filled with objects like furniture, plants, and more. It feels way more lived in than the cold white levels in Goldeneye. The character models also got a significant upgrade in that they look more human compared to Goldeneye. Goldeneye has probably aged the worst in terms of its character models since they look so blocky and out of proportion. This really only holds up if one tries to emulate realistic looking humans, since games like Donkey Kong 64, Zelda, or Conker's Bad Fur Day still look beautiful today, since they look like cartoons and their proportions don't matter. Now that isn't to say that the character models of Perfect Dark look great by today's standard, but they look more human is what I'm trying to say. A lot of people nowadays would still be shocked with how bad some of the characters look like, but trust me, it's a huge step up compared to Goldeneye. The sound is also improved greatly, with the enemies now being able to talk, which adds to the overall atmosphere. Goldeneye was awfully quiet, and had really awkward sections where there was dialogue happening between characters, and they would just be standing still as you were reading text on the top of the screen. Now all characters are voiced, which is a godsend, and enemies will even spout out lines that you caught them by surprise or yell something when they are about to die. It just makes the overall title feel that much more modern. Another really great improvement is in the music. I actually forgot to talk about the music back in my Goldeneye review. Many praise its score for implementing the James Bond theme in so many of its music, and it's indeed very clear that the same composer has worked on many more rare titles, including Banjo-Kazooie or Conker's Bad Fur Day. You can just hear the same style and use of instruments in there. And the same goes for Perfect Dark, only they throw it up a notch. When the action goes down, some of the music that can be heard just gets the blood pumping. And as weird as it sounds, the mission debriefing theme is so awesome that I let it linger on screen for a few seconds longer so I could listen to that rewarding synth a bit more. There's also much more of a story present in the form of cutscenes. Almost every level gets introduced with a cutscene with dialogue, and it also happens multiple times that a cutscene occurs during the mission. The story of Perfect Dark is about a secret war involving two alien races as they try to use various corporations on Earth to get an advantage. This means that some of the later levels get a bit quirky, with you actually going onto alien ships and to alien planets, and these alien levels are done right, unlike Half-Life 1. The levels themselves are varied. You get to fight with some real cool alien weaponry. The weapons themselves also feel great all over, with models looking real nice for its time. You still have the same control scheme with standing still to aim the crosshair over the screen. This makes it to where Goldeneye aged poorly in both its controls and graphics, but for Perfect Dark, it's more only the controls. But what about those other shortcomings I was talking about? Well, it's time to deep dive into that. For the first 7 missions in Goldeneye, I remembered being so surprised how good those levels held up all those years later, and how fun they were to play. In Perfect Dark, though it is fun to play initially due to the action, I noticed that I did not get the same feeling with the earlier levels, nor some of the later levels. There are highlights in the missions that are absolutely awesome. Highlights include the villa in the tropics, the airplane level, or the final level on the alien planet. Very creative and nice to look at, and easy to understand mission objectives. Goldeneye did sometimes suffer from certain objectives needed to have one specific item somewhere in the level. With no radar or map, you were sometimes searching for a long time for what felt like a needle in a haystack. That is sometimes even more so in the case here. There are some written explanations about the objectives, but they only help out so much. The levels are bigger and more complex than ever, but not always in a good way. Some areas feel very maze-like, with many doors, identical looking hallways, and multiple floors. It's very easy to get lost, and after entering the same looking hallway for the 5th time and fighting the same bad guys, it gets a bit repetitive and tedious if you are looking for one specific room or item. Now Goldeneye definitely also has very similar looking environments, but they were a lot smaller and easier to navigate. Never once did I get stuck in Goldeneye, but I got lost and stuck multiple times in Perfect Dark. The snow level, where you have to save the president in particular, is absolutely atrocious, with very narrow paths and areas all over a cave system. Having bigger and more complex levels doesn't have to mean that objectives are less clear. I have also now begun playing Timesplitters 2, a game that was released 2 years later and has some of the same people working on it that worked on Goldeneye. The levels there are even bigger and more complex than in Perfect Dark, but it's also very clear and well streamlined. That is how you do bigger levels, rather than these maze-like designs. Other levels just feel repetitive and maze-like, like Area 51, where you keep going through the same halls over and over and over again, or the sub-control facility, where every hallway looks identical to the other. But it's not only the worst level design in some stages that feels like a step backwards. It also comes in the form of some of the objectives being tedious or unclear. At a certain point you need to take out a radar computer. Once you have found it, you try to destroy it, but the game is very specific about how to destroy it. You try grenades, that doesn't work. If you look around the level, you can find a rocket launcher. You shoot it at a computer, doesn't work. Instead, what you have to do is you have to attach a remote mine against the screen, and only then will it explode in the way it's intended. Another objective that is horrible is the escorting of a hover crate, a big floating box that you need to push around. But the physics are so finicky that you lose control over it every other second, and you need to take that sucker up 2 elevators. It just is not fun, and I could not imagine it being fun for even back in that day. In the last few years, a remaster of the game was released on Xbox Live Arcade, and this title actually addresses some of these issues. You don't need to be as specific with certain objectives. Levels are more clear, and some parts that were confusing are even omitted, and the tedious parts, like the hover crate, are not necessary, and instead, you get a different item that makes way more sense and is easy to understand and use. That specific version of the game may actually feel like an improvement to Goldeneye in terms of level design and objective-based gameplay. And the game is full of these very unlogical or unfun objectives, and it surprised me how much I disliked this campaign more than Goldeneye. Nowadays, the game still gets a lot of praise, but I sometimes think that people praising the game have not actually gone back and replayed it, but instead just repeat what they thought. Because just like that, I too remember that I thought Perfect Dark was the better of the two compared to Goldeneye, but in recent days I have actually come to the conclusion that I like Goldeneye's campaign a lot better. Sometimes less is more. Now the game obviously surpasses Goldeneye in multiplayer features with co-op and multiplayer bots. It's really great in that regard, but the single player campaign is just tedious on some fronts, and I was really surprised to find that out. Level design is confusing and repetitive. Some objectives are tedious or unlogical, and with Goldeneye, I finished that game in 2 days as I just wanted to immediately continue playing after I laid down the controller. But with Perfect Dark, I was quite happy to put that controller away after I completed only 2 or 3 levels each time. Now for score-wise, it's going to be interesting. Were this just the single player campaign, then it would have been much lower than the score I gave Goldeneye. But the presentation like story, music, sound and graphics are all really improved upon. And the multiplayer is of course better too, but I want to mainly focus on the single player in these reviews. The improved presentation of graphics and sound make it to where this title actually gains some points, but in the end, it does still fall short of Goldeneye in my opinion. In the end, Perfect Dark for the Nintendo 64 gets a 7. In all honesty, I was very shocked by this revelation. For so many years in my mind, I held Perfect Dark to a higher standard than Goldeneye, and in the recent days I have come to the conclusion that, for me, that is simply not the case. Goldeneye came out on top, an absolute testament for how good that game was, designed for its time, and how maybe Perfect Dark was a bit too ambitious for the team to handle back in the day. All in all, I'm happy that this is over, and I can now focus on a true game that will surpass Goldeneye by a long shot, and that is Time Splitters 2.